The first time I realized somebody was trying to take my land, I was standing barefoot in wet grass holding a coffee mug that still had steam coming off it. There were bright orange survey flags stabbed into the back edge of my property like little warning signs, running in a perfectly straight line across ground I'd owned for almost 17 years. And the craziest part was, nobody had said a damn word to me. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even some cowardly note tucked into my mailbox pretending to be polite. Just flags. Like the decision had already been made, and I was the last person expected to notice. My name's Russell Grady. I'm 58, divorced, mostly left alone these days except for my old hound dog Walter and a few neighbors who still wave when they drive by. I live outside a town called Belmere, about 40 minutes north of Nashville, in one of those places that used to be quiet farmland before developers started carving it into neat little neighborhoods with names like Pine Hollow Estates and Cedarbrook Preserve. The kind of places where every mailbox matches and somebody'll report you if your trash can stays visible too long after pickup day. When I bought my property back in 2009, nobody wanted it. 4.5 acres, long and narrow, with a low field stretching out behind the house that flooded every spring and baked dry every summer. Realtors called it awkward land. I called it peace. See, I grew up poor. My father worked maintenance at a feed mill, and my mother cleaned motel rooms until her knees gave out. We never owned land. We rented everything, trailers mostly, and every few years somebody sold the property out from under us, and we'd pack our whole life into a pickup truck and move again. So when I finally bought my own place after years driving freight routes across 3 states, it meant something to me. Not because it was fancy, because it wasn't. The house creaked in winter, and the back porch leaned slightly to the left if you looked at it too long. But it was mine. Every inch of it. That's why seeing those flags hit me the way it did. My neighbor Hank was actually the one who tipped me off. Hank's in his 70s, retired welder, always outside smoking cigarettes he swears his doctor doesn't know about. The evening before, he leaned over the fence while I was watering tomato plants and asked, "Russ, you finally sell that back strip?" I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. Sell it to who? He shrugged. Saw a couple men in reflective vests back there this morning measuring things. At the time, I figured they'd wandered too far from one of the construction sites nearby. It happened occasionally. But the next morning, there they were. Orange flags every 20 feet cutting straight through the rear section of my property. I remember standing there staring at them while Walter sniffed around the posts like even he knew something felt off. The thing that really got under my skin wasn't even the trespassing at first. It was the confidence of it. Whoever planted those markers believed that land already belonged to them in some way, like my silence had been mistaken for absence. So I followed the line. It stretched all the way toward the new subdivision behind my property, a place called Maple Briar. Brand new development, maybe 80 homes so far, all identical shades of gray and beige, all with little decorative trees too young to provide actual shade. You could tell exactly what kind of people live there by the signs in their yards. Protect pollinators. Slow down kids at play. In this community, we believe. Nice enough folks on the surface, I guess, but the kind that smile while filing complaints about your fence color. At the entrance stood one of those giant polished signs with fake stonework and a waterfall feature that probably cost more than my first truck. And right beside it was a glossy billboard rendering of the future expansion plan. That's where I saw it. A green walking corridor winding behind the neighborhood with benches, flower beds, decorative lamps, and a little paved trail running exactly where my property line sat. Except according to their drawing, the path didn't stop at the boundary. It cut straight through my land by about 12 feet the entire length of the lot. I actually laughed when I realized what I was looking at, not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievably arrogant it almost circled back around into comedy. Somebody had looked at my field and decided, he's not really using it. And that was enough for them. That afternoon, I drove over to the Maple Briar HOA office. Clean little building near the clubhouse, smelled like vanilla candles and fresh paint inside. A woman at the front desk looked up with one of those customer service smiles that disappears the second you turn around. Her name tag said Denise. "Can I help you?" she asked. I said, "Yeah, somebody put survey markers on my property this morning." Her smile tightened just slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. "Oh," she said softly. "You must be Mr. Grady." That right there told me everything. She said my name the way nurses say it before giving bad news. All careful and rehearsed, And before I even sat down, I knew this wasn't some misunderstanding. Denise folded her hands on the desk and gave me this polished little smile that probably worked great on people who didn't know any better. The association has been reviewing future access improvements for the community, she said, and there may have been some preliminary surveying done near your rear boundary. Near my rear boundary. I almost admired the wording. People like that never say exactly what they mean because exact words can come back and bite you later. I leaned against the counter and said, "You mean on my property?" She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. The developers believed portions of that section were considered undeveloped utility space. I laughed right in her face. Not loud, not angry, just the kind of laugh a man gives when somebody insults his intelligence so casually it catches him off guard. "Lady," I said, "I pay taxes on every inch of that undeveloped utility space." That's when another voice came from down the hallway. "Mr. Grady, right?" A tall guy in a navy polo stepped out carrying a tablet under one arm like it was part of his body. Late 40s maybe, expensive watch, perfectly trimmed beard, teeth so white they almost looked artificial. He introduced himself as Evan Mercer, president of the Maple Briar HOA. And right away I could tell what kind of man he was. Calm voice, controlled posture. The sort of person who thinks being polite automatically means he's reasonable. "Why don't we sit down and discuss this?" he said. So we did. He took me into a conference room with staged family photos hanging on the walls and a bowl of fake green apples sitting in the center of the table. I remember staring at those fake apples while he explained how the walking trail would benefit the entire surrounding community. That phrase kept coming up. Community. As if repeating it enough turned theft into kindness. "The path increases property value for everyone in the area," he said. "And the section in question isn't currently being utilized in any meaningful capacity." There it was again. Utilized. Meaningful capacity. Rich people love replacing simple words with business words when they're trying to take something from you. I asked him one question. "Who approved cutting through my property?" Evan clasped his hands together and said, "The development proposal has already been filed with the county planning office." I nodded slowly. Filed isn't ownership. For the first time, his smile slipped a little. Not much, just enough to expose the irritation underneath. "Mr. Grady," he said, "sometimes compromise benefits everyone." And there it was. The real message. You live alone. You don't use the land. We've got money, lawyers, expansion plans, and a neighborhood full of people who want morning jogging paths. Why make this difficult? The thing is, I almost exploded right there. I wanted to slam my hands on the table and ask who the hell they thought they were. But anger's expensive. It makes people sloppy. My father taught me that years ago after watching him lose arguments his whole life simply because wealthier men knew how to stay calm while he got emotional. So instead, I stood up, thanked them for their time, and drove home in complete silence. When I got back, I pulled the original survey documents from a filing cabinet in my garage. Walter followed me around while I spread papers across the workbench under an old hanging bulb. Every boundary marker matched perfectly. No disputes. No easements. No shared access agreements. Nothing. Legally, they didn't have a leg to stand on. But here's the problem with people like Evan Mercer. They know most folks don't have the energy to fight. They count on exhaustion, delays, legal pressure, public pressure. Eventually people cave just to make the headache stop. And sitting there in my garage that night, listening to crickets outside and the hum of that old light above me, I realized something that bothered me more than the land itself. They had already decided what kind of man I was. Quiet older guy, lives alone, keeps to himself, probably easy to push around. And honestly, maybe a year earlier they would have been right. But something about those survey flags kept eating at me. It reminded me too much of being a kid watching landlords decide our future without ever looking us in the eye. That helpless feeling came rushing back so fast it actually made my chest tighten. I barely slept that night. Around 5 in the morning I got up, poured coffee, sat on the porch and stared out toward the field while fog rolled low across the grass. And then it hit me. They kept saying the land was unused. Not abandoned. Not disputed. Unused. Which meant the entire argument depended on one thing, perception. They wanted the county to see empty space. So I decided to give them something else to look at. By noon I'd rented a compact tractor from a supply yard 10 miles away. The kid helping load it onto the trailer asked what project I was working on, and I told him, petty revenge mostly. He laughed. I wasn't joking. Hank wandered over halfway through the afternoon while I was dragging the field. Russ, he yelled over the engine noise. What the hell are you doing? Farming, I shouted back. Since when? Since this morning. The truth is, I didn't know a damn thing about farming. My mother kept a vegetable garden when I was young, but beyond that, I was improvising. I spent hours online researching fast-growing crops, zoning laws, agricultural protections, water access rules. Turns out Tennessee gives active agricultural land a surprising amount of legal consideration, especially when tied to production use. So I leaned into it hard. Over the next few days, my quiet, useless field transformed completely. I tilled rows across the entire rear section of the property, installed temporary irrigation lines, spread compost, fertilizer, mulch. I planted corn, squash, sunflowers, pole beans, anything dense and aggressive enough to visually scream this is being used. By Wednesday morning, the place looked like a working farm project. Messy, uneven, alive. Exactly the opposite of Maple Briar's carefully controlled aesthetic. Then came the signs. Private agricultural property. No trespassing. Active organic cultivation area. And my personal favorite, pest management in progress. That one really upset them. Because suddenly their picturesque walking trail concept involved suburban moms jogging beside pesticide warning signs and irrigation trenches. The first email arrived before noon. Subject line, urgent community concern. I ignored it. Then came another. Then a phone call. Then two more. By Friday afternoon, Evan Mercer himself pulled into my driveway driving a silver Tesla SUV, so clean it looked computer-generated. He stepped out wearing loafers that immediately sank into the soft dirt near the field edge, and honestly, that moment alone almost made the whole thing worth it. He stared out across the crops like he'd just discovered termites in his kitchen walls. Russell, he said carefully, what exactly is all this? I wiped sweat off my forehead with a rag and said, agriculture. He forced a laugh. Come on. No, seriously, I said. You folks were right. I realized I wasn't utilizing the property enough. His jaw tightened. Behind him, rows of young corn stalks shifted in the wind, while irrigation sprinklers clicked rhythmically back and forth like tiny machine guns. This creates complications, he said. For who? I asked. He looked toward the subdivision behind him. The community had plans. Funny thing about plans, I said, they work better when the land actually belongs to you. He stared at me for several seconds after that. A week later, the entire situation turned into the kind of neighborhood drama people pretend they hate, but secretly live for. You could feel it spreading through Belmere like smoke. Folks at the diner started glancing at me when I walked in. The cashier at Murphy's Feed asked if I was the farm guy fighting the HOA. Even Hank looked entertained every time he wandered over carrying a beer like he'd bought front row tickets to something. And meanwhile, Maple Briar was losing its mind. See, the thing nobody tells you about HOAs is they survive on appearances. They want clean edges, predictable lawns, controlled colors, quiet little lives that photograph well for brochures. My field had become the exact opposite of that. The corn started shooting up faster than I expected, the squash vines spread wild across the soil, and the sunflowers leaned crooked in different directions like drunks at closing time. It looked real. Alive, uncontrolled, and every morning people from the subdivision would stand near the fence pretending not to stare. Some looked annoyed. Some looked curious. A few honestly seemed impressed. One older woman even asked if she could buy vegetables later in the season. I told her probably, assuming I didn't accidentally kill everything first. But not everybody found it charming. 3 days after Evan visited, I found tire tracks near the rear edge of the field where somebody had driven halfway onto my property during the night. Another morning, one of my signs had been knocked over. Then somebody reported me anonymously to the county for unsafe chemical usage. That one almost made me laugh because I hadn't used anything stronger than compost tea and organic pest spray. Still, county inspectors showed up the following Tuesday. 2 men in reflective vests walked the property while I answered questions beside the barn. One of them, younger guy maybe 30 years old, looked around and finally said, "So, what exactly are you producing out here?" "Spite mostly," I said. He tried not to smile. The older inspector didn't bother hiding it. They checked my irrigation setup, looked over receipts for seed and soil treatment, reviewed zoning maps, and after about 40 minutes the older guy closed his folder and said, everything appears compliant. Then he paused for a second and added, "You'd be surprised how often people move next to rural land and suddenly forget agriculture exists." That line stayed with me after they left. Because honestly, this was never really about a walking path. It was about control. Maple Briar wasn't trying to borrow my land temporarily. They were trying to absorb it, smooth out the rough edges around their perfect little development until everything looked curated and convenient. And maybe if I'd been younger, busier, more distracted, they would have succeeded. But life has a strange way of changing what you're willing to tolerate. A few years earlier, my divorce had wrecked me pretty good. 26 years married. Then one day, my ex-wife decided she was tired of living small. That was the phrase she used. Living small. She moved to Atlanta with a financial advisor named Keith, who apparently wore scarves indoors. For a long time after that, I honestly stopped caring about much. The field sat untouched because I barely had energy to mow half the property most weeks. I worked, slept, repeated. Quiet became survival. And maybe that's partly why Maple Briar misread me. They saw isolation and mistook it for weakness. But there's a difference between a man who's quiet and a man who's surrendered. One afternoon, about a month into all this, I was repairing a section of irrigation tubing when I noticed a little girl standing near the fence behind Maple Briar. Couldn't have been older than 10. She watched the field for a minute before finally asking, "Mister, are those sunflowers?" I nodded. "They'll bloom in another few weeks." "My mom says you ruined the view," she said. "Kids will say anything straight to your face." I laughed. "Maybe your mom liked boring views." The girl giggled. Then she asked if she could have one when they bloomed. I told her sure. After she ran off, I sat there thinking about how weird the whole situation had become. Because underneath all the legal nonsense and HOA politics, this was really a fight over what a place is allowed to be. Wild or controlled, personal or communal, real or sanitized. Around mid-August, things finally reached a breaking point. Maple Briar held one of their monthly HOA meetings, and apparently my farm had become agenda item number 1. I know this because Hank's niece lived in the subdivision and secretly recorded part of it on her phone. According to her, residents argued for almost an hour. Some wanted legal action. Others thought the HOA had overstepped from the beginning. One homeowner stood up and asked why the association had assumed they could build on private property before securing written agreements. That question apparently made the room go dead quiet. Evan Mercer, from what I heard, tried to keep control of the meeting, but people were getting frustrated. Not because of me necessarily, but because they realized the HOA had gambled with money and plans before actually owning the land needed for the project. And once homeowners start thinking an HOA board looks incompetent, panic spreads fast. 2 mornings later, I woke up and noticed something strange. The survey flags were gone. Every single one. I walked the rear property line just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Nothing remained except small holes in the dirt where the markers used to stand. No announcement. No apology. No explanation. Just erased. A few days after that, the development website quietly updated their expansion renderings. The green corridor had been rerouted completely inside subdivision boundaries. No path across my property anymore. Like the entire idea had never existed. And honestly, that should have felt like victory. In some ways it did. But what surprised me most was how different the land itself felt afterward. Somewhere along the way, the field stopped being part of the fight and became part of my life again. Every morning, I'd walk the rows with coffee while the sun came up. Walter chased rabbits through the corn. The soil that had sat untouched for years suddenly had purpose again. Not because developers forced me to use it, but because defending it reminded me why I bought it in the first place. Ownership isn't just paperwork. It's relationship, time, memory, boundaries. And people who've never had something taken from them rarely understand that. Now, did I overreact? Maybe some people think so. I've read enough online comments to know opinions split fast whenever property and community collide. Some folks think I should have compromised. Others think I should have sued them into the ground. Personally, I think people get a little too comfortable deciding what someone else needs, especially when money enters the conversation. Last I heard, Evan Mercer stepped down from the HOA board a few months later. No clue whether this situation caused it or not, but I'd be lying if I said that detail didn't make me smile a little. As for the farm, well, turns out I actually enjoyed it. The first harvest wasn't pretty, but it was real. I donated half the produce to a local food pantry and gave the rest away to neighbors, including a few from Maple Briar. Even the older woman who asked about vegetables got her tomatoes. And the little girl by the fence? Yeah, she got the very first sunflower. Funny enough, the field everybody called useless ended up feeding people. So maybe there's a lesson somewhere in that. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe sometimes the only reason people think they can take from you is because you haven't reminded them they can't. And I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought back the same way? Or would you have let the walking trail happen for the sake of the community? Let me know down in the comments, because honestly, I still see people argue both sides every time this story comes up. And if you enjoyed this one, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because out here, small town battles have a funny way of turning into legends.